Alors, incominciamo avec la deuxième partie. On va introduire qu'Uoldelul, Chelati Dirar et Francesco Filippi, qui est ici avec nous en présentiel, et encore avec Dawit. Alors, j'aimerais commencer avec l'introduction de Monsieur Dirar. Est-ce qu'il est là? Bonjour, Monsieur Dirar. Piacere. Qu'Uoldelul Chelati Dirar is an historian born in Asmara, Eritrea. He has dealt mainly with the history of the Horn of Africa, and in particular, Eritrea and Ethiopia in the colonial period. His research focuses on the processes of forming local elites and the development of nationalist ideologies. Since 2003, qu'Uoldelul Chelati Dirar is an associate professor of African history in the Faculty of Political Science at the History of Macerata, Italy. Between 2010 and 2016, Dirar has also served as vice chancellor for international relations at the University of Macerata. qu'Uoldelul Chelati Dirar est un historien né à Asmara, Érythrée. Il s'intéresse principalement à l'histoire de la Corne de l'Afrique, en particulier l'Érythrée et de l'Éthiopie à l'époque coloniale. Ses recherches portent sur les processus formant les élites locales et le développement des idéologies nationalistes. Depuis 2003, il est professeur associé de l'histoire africaine à la faculté de sciences politiques de l'Université de Macerata en Italie. Entre 2010 et 2016, M. Dirar a occupé le poste de vice-chancelier pour les relations internationales de l'Université de Macerata. Francesco Filippi est avec nous. Bienvenuto.
Grazie. Merci bien. Grazie.
He is an historian specialized in history of mentalities and a teacher of Dienna, a social promotion organization. He published Mussolini ha fatto anche cose buone, l'idiozia che continuano a circolare sul fascismo, ma perché siamo ancora fascisti? Un conto rimasto aperto e noi però li abbiamo fatto le strade. La colonie italienne tra bugia, razzismi e amnésie en 2021 par Baibolati Boringhieri. Alors, the book Mussolini ha fatto anche cose buone has been translated in English by Baraka Books and in French by Hubert. Francesco Filippi est un historien spécialisé en histoire des mentalités et un enseignement de l'Association de promotion sociale Dienna. Il a publié Mussolini ha fatto anche cose buone, l'idiozia che continuiamo a circolare sul fascismo, ma perché siamo ancora fascisti, un conto rimasto aperto e noi però li abbiamo fatto le strade. La colonie italienne tra bugie, racismi et amnésie en 2021 chez la maison d'édition Bolatti Boringhieri. Le livre Mussolini ha fatto anche buone cose est paru en traduction anglaise chez la maison d'édition montréalaise Baraka Books et en traduction française chez la maison d'édition Hubert. Alors, bienvenue les deux et aussi à Dawit. Et on va commencer avec Dawit, c'est ça?
Thank you.
Merci tout le monde.
Thank you for staying. I just want to, again, a couple of preliminary remarks. So what I want to reiterate is, as I said earlier, the research for the project began 2010, 11, 12, with the arrival of the young Eritreans into Italy. And with them, the resurfacing of these repressed histories of coloniality that exist between Eritrea and Italy. But the roots of the project, in a sense, go back much earlier to 1998, when qu'Uoldelul and I were both living and working in Asmara at the same time, when the conflicts between Eritrea and Ethiopia reignited, sort of resurfacing sort of these legacies of coloniality. And so, to reiterate what I said earlier, embedded within the title is this idea of what one does with available space, Spazio Disponibile. And so, implied sort of within this is this indication that for the Italian colonial project, the Eritrean or the African space is conceived as empty, as waiting for modernity to happen. And so an important question that emerges for me is not how I fill that space. I'm reiterating because this is a conversation that I had with somebody at break, but how I work with that empty space so that sanitized or convenient histories are looked at with a certain honesty and with a certain care. Second important question that arises for me sort of out of this is there's the formation of Italy that we will talk about as a nation state, but there's also the formation of the role of indigenous Eritreans within the formation of the Eritrean nation state. So that as Italy is being formed, as Italy is being formed, the labor of Eritreans is also producing the modern Eritrean subject. And so it was important for me to reflect on what it means, historical agency, for subjects within Eritrea to operate not as passive objects onto which history and modernity was being projected, but as agents of modernity itself. So in a work like A Constant Retelling of the History, what you see is this interrogation of the labor of Italians in Canada at the early 20th century and the labor of Eritreans. Now, this gesture is not about conflating the two and saying that they are the same thing. It is about asking, within the context of nation building in Italy, where Italians play a crucial role, and within the context of nation building in Eritrea, where Italians play a different role, how do those dynamics of power operate against each other? So this is an important thing for me to think about. And so I'm interested in facilitating a dialogue so that the modern formation of Eritrea and Italy are inextricably linked with one another. So how do we look at that kind of a history? Another important question for me is the continuities and discontinuities from liberal era Italy to fascist era Italy, and how these intersect with the colonial project. So how do we balance a careful critique so that we're analyzing both, right? So that the entire colonial project does not begin and end under fascism. It begins much earlier. So the overemphasis of the fascist element implies that we've eliminated fascism, we've dealt with the colonial project. So how that uncomfortable question can resonate. Amnesia versus displacement. Right, so the push of wanting to forget something versus the pull of selectively recalling and remembering it, and what that means and how that can be interrogated. I think those are the key questions and sort of ideas that inform, right, the historical, political sort of dimensions of the project. And so I just want to open it up to qu'Uoldelul and to Francesco, and then we will continue with the questions at that point.
So we'll allow qu'Uoldelul to speak first.
Thank you. Can you hear me properly? Thank you. So first of all, good afternoon to those in Montreal, and good evening to those on the other side of the ocean like myself. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure, though I have to confess that I'm also disappointed because at the end of this you will enjoy your drinks and I will have to go to bed because here is evening, as it is really unfair. However, not to waste anymore your time, just to somehow answer to Dawit's suggestions. I think the common thread that I can find between my research and the marvelous work that Dawit has been doing is this focus on what he's described as the way intimacy became strangeness. That is where I find the connection between our work. And from this perspective, I think that there is a variety of epistemological issues which need to be addressed. And as I have only 10 minutes, I will just point very briefly to 3 of them, and I hope there will be time in the question and answer session to further elaborate on those. The first issue is about mobility. Dawit has been working on contemporary mobility. I have been working on past mobility, so mobility during colonial time from Eritrea to different directions, not just Europe, but also the Sudan, the Yemen, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. Why I'm pointing to mobility, why I say the mobility is a sort of epistemological issues, because I have the feeling that sometimes there is a kind of attitude to look at colonial mobility in continuity with contemporary mobility, whether I think it is important to look also at the differences as element of discontinuity. From my point of view, what I've been trying to do with my research is important to see how mobility from the Horn of Africa is not just, of course, a contemporary phenomenon, but it has a very long history, a very long route, and a route where Africans from the Horn of Africa were not just passive actors, but they had their own agency. Okay, so you have people already by the end of the 18th century moving to Italy, not just as servants or subalterns, but with their own agenda, just with their own projects of life and success, being that for study, for religious training, for even for adventure. Okay, so it's important to diversify this range of experiences. There is, of course, a very important aspect which I think has really marked Eritrean history is military mobility. Eritrea has basically supplied the Italian colonial army through starting from the Libyan invasion to the invasion of conquest of Somalia, the 1935 invasion of Ethiopia. So colonial mobility is very important. It's called askaris were, traveling all over northeastern Africa as canon fodder for the colonial expansion. But you also have askaris paraded in Rome repeatedly as evidence of the achievements, of colonial dreams of civilization. And it is important because those mobilities also, pave the way to further process of mobility. So you have askaris who moved more or less autonomously later on to Italy and established there. They have their own families and so on and so forth. Mobility is also, colonial mobility is also a very important component, a leitmotif of literature. You have a lot of literature written in Tigrinya, one of the languages of Eritrea and also Ethiopia, which focuses exactly on issue of mobility and conflict and colonial armies and so on and so forth. The most famous is probably the one written by Abba Gebreyesus Hailu, which has been translated in English by Germaine Gash. I'm just finished now the translation of it in Italian, so that will be also an opportunity to look at it from a different perspective. But there are also, there is a variety of other authors like Isaac Georgis, which again have written about traveling and itineraries. So the issue of mobility seems to be something with a very deep root in the intellectual and cultural history of the Horn of Africa. The other point I wanted to raise is the issue, the second epistemological issue I wanted to raise is the one of memory. Memory is something which recurs frequently in the Dawit work. And the memory is also something which I've been dealing with because we normally focus on the issue of lack of memory in Italy of its colonial past, the so-called rimozione of the colonialismo. But I think there is a kind of mirror process because if you look also at how the memory of colonialism is articulated, is developed in Eritrea, but at large in the Horn of Africa, I think that also on the other side of the story, there is a very complex and ambiguous relation with memory. Okay, just to give you a very quick point to think of, in Eritrea, colonialism is always mentioned as a sort of a very important component of Eritrean history, a watershed, and I would say even as a key how can you say, sort of key component of Eritrean claim for independence, because the claim for Eritrean independence is also based on this alleged transformative impact of colonialism on Eritrean societies. But at the same time, there is a surprising paucity of analysis of how this transformation worked and where this transformation operated, whether on the whole Eritrean population, only on some section of the Eritrean population, at what level, and so on and so forth. So it's more a sort of, in my understanding, more a sort of cliche rather than a deep down analysis. And I don't have time here to further elaborate, but we could say the same for Ethiopia and Somalia. So I have the feeling that this unsolved, unfinished business with colonialism is not only an Italian problem, but it's also a problem on the side of the former colonies, of the former colonized. Very quickly, to conclude, the third aspect, which the third epistemological issue, which I think emerged from the Dawit work, and which also somehow crosses my research, is the issue, he mentioned repeatedly the issue of infrastructure and architecture. So I would rather define it as the complex relationship which I can notice in particular in Eritrea with the built-in heritage, the colonial built-in heritage, and the role that it plays in the definition and formation of Eritrean identity. And as an example, I will like to mention the recent successful application by the Eritrean government for the inclusion of the city of Asmara in the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites. And for me, it was really fascinating as a historian to look at the way the application was framed, because it is an application which apparently was completely expunged of the problematic dimension of the development of colonial Asmara. No? So all the issue of labor, being that Eritrean labor or Italian labor, the issue of race, those what we celebrate as a World Heritage Site was basically planned for according to racial definition of the space. Okay, so basically was space non-disponibile, if you want to maintain the same analogy, for Eritreans, because they cannot freely move there and they couldn't have a place there unless they were servants of some Italians. Okay, but also I think it is missing from this application the issue of agency. So it is a kind of sanitized representation of the colonial space without any mention of how this space could actually be claimed as Eritrean. And I think that this place can be claimed as Eritrean because of the agency of Eritreans that through time have reinvented the meaning of those spaces. They have re-owned somehow those places, and they have made them, and they're still making them component of the Eritrean daily life. From this point of view, I think it's very dangerous the fact that somehow indirectly, it seems to me that maybe for marketing purposes, but there is still an attitude also on the Eritrean side in maintaining this cliché of Asmara as a sleeping beauty, where Asmara as a sleeping beauty bring to me the idea that those people are just interested on the stones and the glasses, not on the people who live and who give meanings, continually changing meaning to those spaces and those architecture. So those are the three key issues which I wanted to address following Dawit's suggestion, and I think my 10 minutes are just over now. So there will be, I hope, further chances for addressing more in depth some of those issues.
Francesco, the floor is yours to speak to Dawit.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Merci à tout le monde. C'est beau être ici, à Casa d'Italia. I suppose I will talk about memory of colonialism, Italian colonialism. But talking about the memory of Italian colonialism is like to talk about nothing. And for talking about nothing, I prefer Italian. So adesso parlerò in italiano. Grazie dell'invito. Ci sei?
Oh.
Okay. Grazie.
Online.
Fabrizio è l'altra metà del mio cielo oggi. E ringrazio molto Dawit Petros non solo per l'invito e per la disponibilità, ma anche per aver centrato quello che lui ha definito all'inizio di questa presentazione un importante triangolo tra l'Italia, il Canada e l'Eritrea.
Je remercie tout d'abord pour l'opportunité, pour m'avoir invité ici, mais surtout pour avoir construit cette rencontre sur l'important fait de la centralité de l'Italie, du Canada et de l'Érythrée sur ce point.
Quando noi dobbiamo pensare al colonialismo italiano ci dobbiamo porre una domanda che secondo me Spazio Disponibile affronta, e cioè perché gli italiani creano le proprie colonie? Perché gli italiani vanno all'estero a costruire colonie?
Pour la question des colonies, la première chose à voir, c'est pourquoi l'Italie veut des colonies, pourquoi les Italiens vont à l'étranger et veulent essayer d'agrandir leur espace.
Come è stato già detto, il colonialismo italiano non è un'esperienza corta, si parla di quasi un secolo. Nel 1869 per la prima volta l'Italia ha, attraverso una operazione commerciale coloniale, un pezzo d'Africa, la baia di Assab.
L'histoire coloniale italienne n'est pas brève, elle dure plus d'un siècle. Premier exemple, c'est les premiers espaces coloniaux italiens datent de 1869 et d'être dans
la baia d'Assab.
La baie de Assab.
Sul Mar Rosso.
Sur la mer Rouge.
1869 significa 7 anni dopo la nascita dello Stato italiano e 2 anni prima dell'entrata a far parte dello Stato italiano di Roma. L'Italia ha prima un pezzo d'Africa che la sua stessa capitale. Perché?
L'Italie a juste 8 ans et c'est 3 ans 2-3 ans avant la prise de possession de Rome par l'État italien. Donc pourquoi l'Italie a d'abord un bout d'Afrique avant d'avoir sa propre capitale?
E poi il momento coloniale finisce molto tardi in Italia. L'ultimo ammaina bandiera, l'ultima calata di bandiera italiana in Africa data 1 luglio 1960, con la fine del mandato italiano a Mogadiscio, in Somalia.
L'expérience coloniale italienne finit aussi très tard. Le dernier drapeau italien va être descendu en 1960 en Somalie.
Un secolo in cui gli italiani sono stati colonialisti ma non ne hanno memoria. Perché gli italiani vanno all'estero? bisogna uscire dalla storia e entrare nella psicologia, a mio modo di vedere.
Un siècle de colonialisme et les Italiens n'en ont aucune mémoire. Alors pourquoi on va à l'étranger? Faut peut-être essayer de chercher ça dans des motifs psychologiques.
Gli italiani vanno all'estero per dimostrare a se stessi e al resto del mondo di essere bianchi. E questa è una chiave di lettura che spiega tutto il colonialismo italiano. Perché tra 8 e 900 non era certo che gli italiani appartenessero a quella Europe, identificata con Gran Bretagna, Francia e paesi nordici, che faceva della whiteness, della bianchezza, il proprio centro.
Faut peut-être rechercher le motif de l'italien vers l'étranger pour voir que les Italiens veulent probablement essayer de démontrer qu'ils sont blancs. Et que, parce que ce n'est pas trop certain dans l'Europe des années 1800 que les Italiens soient vraiment des Européens blancs. Donc, il faut rechercher dans cela la motivation qui va pousser les Italiens ailleurs.
Mentre l'Italia costruisce il suo impero coloniale occupando le ultime terre rimaste libere, Baia di Assab, Asmara, che poi verrà inventata dagli italiani come Eritrea, gli stessi italiani emigrano qui, nel Nuovo Mondo, e quando sbarcano alla frontiera a Ellis Island, a New York, e vengono sottoposti al terribile processo di racial screening, pochi, davvero pochi tra loro raggiungono i punti più alti della whiteness, riservata a scandinavi, tedeschi, inglesi, eccetera.
Au même moment où les Italiens vont aller en Afrique et vont créer avec la Baia di
Ellis Island. Ah, la Baia di Assab.
Vont créer artificiellement l'Érythrée en allant en Afrique. En même moment, les Italiens qui émigrent en Amérique du Nord et qui débarquent en vue de la Statue de la Liberté, vont être soumis au terrible processus de savoir combien ils sont blancs et s'ils sont blancs. Et il y en a très très peu qui tombent vraiment dans les catégories blanches.
La cosa estremamente interessante del lavoro di Dawit Petros è che riesce a dimostrare le due grandi lotte per l'identità che gli italiani conducono nel mondo. La prima, feroce, sanguinosa, per un'identità di superiorità in Africa. La seconda, altrettanto dolorosa, per una identità di minorità che vuole essere accettata, proprio qui, nel Nuovo Mondo.
L'étude de Petros.
Dawit Petros.
Scusa, c'est le nom que je suis très mauvais avec les noms de famille, excusez. Qui est de montrer du doigt que il y a deux grandes luttes féroces et douloureuses. La première, c'est une lutte pour la suprématie de la race blanche italienne en Afrique. Et d'un autre côté, c'est, ici dans le Nouveau Monde, c'est une minorité qui n'est pas acceptée comme blanche et qui va faire un combat de minorité pour être acceptée.
I due modi di combattere questa battaglia formano gli italiani. Italiani che quando vanno in Africa cercano i neri per dimostrare di essere bianchi e quando li trovano si comportano in maniera razzialmente divisiva, cioè devono vincere, devono conquistare, devono dimostrare di essere superiori. Il colonialismo bianco italiano si specifica per una forte aggressività. L'Italia usa i gas contro l'impero d'Etiopia nel 1935-36, cosa che non avrebbe mai fatto il fascismo nemmeno in Europa quando perde la guerra nel 1943. Perché? Perché la guerra in Europa è una guerra tra bianchi, tra uomini. Quella in Etiopia, come gran parte delle guerre coloniali, è una guerra purtroppo di civiltà e di disinfestazione.
Donc, les Italiens, quand ils vont en Afrique, ils cherchent la population noire, ils cherchent les Noirs pour démontrer d'être blancs et se comporter comme blancs, et donc se comporter avec agressivité, tant et si bien que les Italiens, en 1935, en Éthiopie, vont utiliser les gaz contre les populations civiles. Des gaz que les Italiens ne vont jamais penser d'utiliser pendant la guerre, même quand ils sont en train de perdre en 1943.
Quando in Italia, dopo la prima guerra mondiale, va al potere il fascismo, e quindi questa idea di Stato nuovo vuole creare nuovi italiani, i riflessi sul racconto dell'identità si hanno in tutti i mondi in cui gli italiani stanno. Questo e anche l'Africa. In due passaggi, attraverso la costruzione di un'identità fisica, Asmara, patrimonio dell'UNESCO, costruire per rimanere, o la Casa d'Italia, costruire per ribadire di essere in grado di costruire, di essere, di esistere, e anche attraverso la formazione di un'identità culturale.
Quand le fascisme va prendre le pouvoir, il va relancer cette importance de l'idée de suprématie et de race à tous les niveaux et dans tous les scénarios où elle va se trouver et à tous les endroits où elle est. Par exemple, va construire Asmara, qui est un patrimoine de l'UNESCO, mais aussi pour démontrer qu'ils peuvent construire quelque chose qui soit éternel encore. Mais aussi ici, par exemple, la Casa d'Italia, pour démontrer à la population et au gouvernement et à leurs concitoyens canadiens qu'ils savent et peuvent construire.
Una corsa faticosa per capire chi si è. Il lavoro di Dawit Petros è prezioso perché ci dimostra che in realtà, quando gli italiani escono dall'Italia, lo fanno per cercare se stessi, per cercare di autodefinirsi. E il paradosso è che in questi luoghi, il Canada, il Nuovo Mondo o il mondo antichissimo dell'Africa, sono entrambi questi mondi che raccontano agli italiani chi gli italiani relativamente ed effettivamente siano. È l'Africa che dice agli italiani chi sono e chi non sono. È il Nuovo Mondo che dice agli italiani chi possono o non possono essere. Il lavoro di Dawit Petros in questo senso è un enorme lavoro di identità triangolata che tiene in piedi soprattutto il nostro modo di esserci pensati. E io lo ritengo fantastico. Mi fermo qui al momento.
Donc c'est paradoxal. Les Italiens vont à l'étranger pour apprendre à se connaître, à savoir qui vraiment ils sont. Ils le font en Afrique, dans le vieux monde, dans l'antique monde, mais aussi dans le nouveau monde. Donc ils viennent ici et puis pour apprendre à savoir qui ils sont et qui ils peuvent être et aussi qu'est-ce qu'ils ne peuvent pas être. Le travail de M. Petros est fantastique, je remercie beaucoup et excellent, bravo.
Merci. Alors, on ouvre la conversation entre vous trois. On commence avec tes réponses, Dawit, tes réflexions.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, qu'Uoldelul. I think, Francesco, you speak to something which is, and I don't even really have a question, more a, listening to you speak brought me back to sort of, these experiences and these encounters, which were very important as I was in Italy, in Sicily, in Catania specifically, spending time with many Eritreans who had made this difficult journey. And it is important, I have to sort of acknowledge and recognize that that is not my experience. I'm not attempting to claim that as an experience. But in that context, we're having a number of conversations. And the question that I could not leave, that would not leave my mind, was about the irony and the tragedy of Italy with its history of emigration being transformed into the gate of the Mediterranean, and what that implied, what that implied. So you speak of, so that the transformation of, the transformation of the Mediterranean into a grave.
Yeah.
Also, compelled me to sort of the work that produced this, that came into this, was a project called The Stranger's Notebook. And one of those central images was an image of Italians on their way to North America in a ship called the SS Utopia in 1891 that hits another ship in the Straits of Gibraltar, and many southern Italians, many southern Italians died. So it's this kind of historical sort of complexity, irony, and sort of tragedy. And as you say, the fact that Italians who occupy the lowest strata of social sort of positioning within the context of North America when they arrive, and that's the other part of the, historical irony.
Sì, ironico e tragico, effettivamente. E l'Italia si forma nella sua costruzione anche dopo il 1945, quindi dopo la fine del fascismo e dopo la fine del colonialismo, non su una identità a specchio, sono come qualcuno, ma su una identità di opposizione, sono diverso da questo qualcuno.
Oui, fascinant et tragique. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est comment se crée l'identité italienne, même après la chute du fascisme. À partir de 1946, l'Italie, la mentalité italienne ne se pose pas comme une mentalité miroir en « Ah, je suis pareil à », mais par contre, en contreposition, donc, je ne suis pas comme ceux-là.
Gli italiani nella seconda guerra mondiale perdono le loro colonie, vengono cacciati da quello che gli italiani chiamano oltremare e si produce una frattura culturale nei confronti di quello che era stato il grande trait d'union della civiltà, il Mediterraneo. Dopo il 1945 è come se il paese Italia si girasse completamente guardando verso nord e smettesse di guardare a sud.
En 1945, avec la défaite de la guerre, l'Italie perd toutes ses colonies et donc perd aussi son regard vers le sud de la Méditerranée. L'Italie qui a toujours été centrale, on dirait qu'elle se retourne et qu'elle ne regarde plus qu'au nord et perd complètement tout contact avec le sud.
Il colonialismo non va più di moda come tratto identitario, la fine dell'impero britannico, per esempio, e gli italiani continuano a raccontare se stessi nella grande via del mondo attraverso l'emigrazione, perché continuano ad essere un popolo di emigranti, milioni e milioni di persone.
Fin du colonialisme, même du colonisme britannique, et les Italiens vont se retrouver à regarder vers le monde comme un pays d'émigrants, parce que la grande émigration italienne va continuer après la guerre encore et encore.
Fino a quando nel 1990 c'è un giorno della storia italiana che verrà ricordato in cui l'Italia dovrà di nuovo girarsi, è il 4 agosto 1991. In Puglia, al porto di Bari, arriva una nave carica di migliaia, decine di migliaia di profughi albanesi. Per la prima volta l'Italia è un paese a forte immigrazione e per la prima volta è l'oltremare che viene a trovare l'Italia.
Et là encore, il va falloir regarder nouvellement vers le sud, mais c'est arrivé récemment, lorsque le 4 août 1991, pour la première fois, un bateau plein à rebord de dizaines de milliers d'Albanais va débarquer sur les côtes italiennes, et donc l'Italie va se retrouver pour la première fois en pays d'immigration avec des immigrants qui rentrent et non plus qui sortent.
Gli italiani non hanno letteralmente le parole per descrivere quello che sta accadendo. e le vanno a cercare nell'ultima volta in cui si sono confrontati con la colonia, con l'oltremare. Ecco che negli anni 90 gli italiani parlano dell'altro come dell'immigrato che invade. Ci rubano le nostre donne. Come se questi invasori fossero il prezzo da pagare per un mondo che non si ricorda più. E il linguaggio di colonia ritorna ad essere presente.
Donc, les Italiens n'ont pas de langage pour parler de ces gens-ci. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est pas dans leurs habitudes. Donc, ils reprennent le langage précédent, le langage colonial, mais en mettant sur l'autre, celui qui arrive, une connexion de danger. Ces gens qui nous volent nos femmes, qui nous volent nos travail. E
quindi concludo dicendo, tu, Dawit, chiedi perché questo paradosso ironico? Perché è inaccettabile per un'identità che si vuole bianca questo brutale paragone tra le barche che arrivano da sud e le barche che attraversano Gibilterra. Il problema dell'Italia oggi è che l'immigrazione ripropone il tema del chi siamo noi? Siamo veramente bianchi?
L'ironie, c'est donc la contraposition entre les bateaux qui arrivent et ceux qui partent. Et malheureusement, le problème remonte à la question identitaire des Italiens qui restent toujours, est-ce que nous sommes vraiment blancs?
Merci.
I don't think. Oh yeah, you can. Yeah, Uoldelul. I wanted to ask you two quick questions. I think it's very important for me to hear sort of your thoughts on sort of what I described sort of earlier as the intersection. How the move from liberal to fascist era Italy sort of intersects within the colonial project. And then sort of connected to that is I would also like to hear your the importance of understanding how this speaking back also happens within the context of Eritrea. And so what are some of the challenges that exist within the context of the Eritrean memorial space in relationship to the Italian colonial history?
Okay, sorry, I was taking notes of your questions. Well, they're both very complex questions to answer, to address in a few minutes. The intersection between the liberal and fascist experience with regard to colonialism is a very complex issue because normally normally in the public opinion there is understanding that somehow the liberal period was a relatively nice one and the fascist was a bad one. Whether I think it is much more complex and nuanced because, just to give you an example, the issue of race. Okay, so normally there is understanding that racism is a kind of peculiar feature of fascism, but if you look at the way the colonial space was built since the beginning of the 20th century, so when you have the first urban planning in Eritrea in 1908, already you see that one of the dominant criteria is exactly race. So you have a district reserved to white people and district reserved to black people. So that already is an example of continuity between the two experiences. But of course, there are also elements of discontinuity, and I think it is related to the role which colonialism played in the foreign policy, if you want, of the Italian state. So during the liberal period, I have the feeling that the colonial expansion was something which was not so central, so crucial in the narrative of the state. And particularly after the defeat of Adwa in 1896, there was spread a deep embarrassment. So the Italian government wanted somehow to hide this colonial experience. though I slightly disagree with this idea just expressed of colonialism as a search for whiteness, because it is a component, but I wouldn't say it's a dominant component. It's a much more articulate and nuances. You have to look also at industrial groups which are interested in colonialism and others which did not have, and so on and so forth. With the big change with fascism was can be found in the fact that fascism put the colonial experience at the center of its propaganda and of its foreign policy. So it was a key component. That is where you really find a big difference. The other big difference is that fascism, exactly because of its totalitarian nature, wanted to bring this totalitarian format also in the colony. So this goes through what you have worked on, the architecture. Okay, so the architecture, the way they were changing the ancient town in Italy, also they were trying to do the same in the colonies. The mobilization of the people, the masses, as they used to say at those times. You have the balilla in Italy, you have the balilla, also the black balilla, if you allow me the term, in Ethiopia and Eritrea. So this is the main difference, this idea of making also the colony a space which is a totalitarian space. Of course, there are many other aspects which would be worth being investigated, but I think we don't have time here. For instance, the issue of resources, okay, the resources which the state allocated. Of course, the fascist regime allocated much more resources, but not because it was functional to its dreams of building an empire, where they were expecting to transfer millions of unemployed Italians from many different regions of the Italian state. If I have to address the second issue, this is much more complex, and you know why. So the challenges of this complex and ambiguous relationship with colonialism in the Horn of Africa, and particularly in Eritrea. First of all, why is it is ambiguous, and then which are the challenges? It is ambiguous, as I mentioned earlier, because you always find this mention of colonialism in the political discourse, narrative, and so on and so forth, but it is never really articulated. The colonialism is a sort of vague cliche, but as I said, there is no real analysis of the impact of colonialism in the economy, for instance, in the cultural patterns of the country, of gender relations, ethnic relations. That is something we never talk about in Eritrea because it's a sort of taboo, but colonialists played heavily with this. And also, we never talk about it because, again, it's something a little bit embarrassing, but racism is something which we share with fascism. Eritrean society is not a society which looks at all communities in equal terms. There are always citizens who have more rights than other citizens. So I wonder how much of this could be also associated with the colonial heritage. So which are the challenges? The challenges, I think, are exactly the one which I somehow mentioned as social embarrassment. So we still need to assess, for instance, the extent of the Italian impact on the legal institution in Eritrea, on economic development, on balance of power between communities, and also the way we look at ourselves. I always remember this embarrassing joke which an employee of the Ethiopian Airlines made with an Italian professor which was flying from Addis Ababa to I think Nairobi, and the employee asked the lady, "So you're flying to Africa?" Okay. And it speaks volumes of the way people in the whole of Africa and Ethiopia look at themselves. So this is a deeply racist regard, and it is something which is not clear if we somehow share with the Italians or we inherited from the Italians. So also this is a challenge which I think we need to face, to investigate. And finally, I still wonder to what extent this deep involvement of Eritreans as colonial troops, at certain point, according to some scholars, about something between 30 and 40% of the male labor was somehow employed in the military. I doubt this is a correct figure, but even if it was 20%, how much this deep militarization of Eritrean labor has shaped the political mind of the Eritrean? How much our continuous insistence in involvement in conflict has been somehow shaped by this experience? I hope I answered some of your questions.
Say that we have about 6 minutes and 50 seconds, which includes questions from the audience. Sorry to put that pressure on you all. Sì, permesso.
Subito arrivo, va bene. Ma stavo appunto.
Il servizio è ottimo.
Dottore, guardi, vorrei chiedere una cosa a lei. Questa è una cosa che io insomma sono molti anni che sono qua. Il giorno che sono partito, è vero? Sono partito con l'idea chiara, va bene? Non voglio vivere più al paesino mio e voglio cambiare paese. Un po' la storia, insomma l'America, così con là. Però non ho avuto mai paura di essere stato un emigrante, per esempio, di mettere l'accento che vada a essere un emigrante, ma lungi da pensare da queste cose. Mi sono preparato nel senso che devo imparare l'inglese, devo parlare francese, il freddo, la tradizione, la cultura differente, mi sono preparato a queste cose, ma non ho mai pensato a tutta questa forma di, no, una buona parte di razzismo contro cioè nemigrì. Dunque, questa storia così dispregiativa, così bestiale, dispregiativa proprio, nasce da che cosa? Ma che emigrante che vuol dire? Io emigro, cioè da un paese vado a vivere in un altro paese. Ma se io vado lì e esplico il mio lavoro onestamente, questa storia di essere un emigrante, ma a me che me ne frega, insomma, in poche parole. È vero? Quindi questo dire, cioè in emigrei, è ancora questa forma di razzismo un po' è basata sulla storia che uno è emigrante. Ma questo emigrante che diavolo di male fa se va a vivere in un altro paese e fa il suo lavoro e lo fa bene? Dov'è il problema? Ecco, la domanda mia è questa. Questa storia di stuccicarci e dire sono emigrati, è come disprezzare. Io non tanto adesso, ma prima di queste cose sono emigrati, ne ho sentito di dire, ma da cosa esce? Da una cattiveria? Ho finito, questa è la domanda mia. Mi sembra che mi ha capito, eh? Se non ha capito, insisto ancora.
Io credo di averla capita benissimo. E la ringrazio. Posso rispondere io?
Sì.
Io la ringrazio per questa, che è una testimonianza molto chiara di che cosa significhi spostarsi. L'idea dello spostarsi per lavoro, per amore, per farsi gli affari propri, tra l'altro è insita nell'essere umano. Io gliela sciolgo come una battuta. Molti parlano delle radici, anche qua in Quebec. Vero? Però non so se lei ha notato che non siamo alberi, signore mio. Abbiamo i piedi, siamo fatti per spostarci. Il problema è quando determinati, i sociologi li chiamano blocchi di identità, cioè stati, nazioni, paesi, che hanno delle necessità politiche per costruire attorno a sé barriere, confini, definizioni di barriere e confini, mettono un accento anche qualitativo su chi viene da fuori, c'è il problema. Se noi la pensassimo tutti come lei e se noi avessimo avuto tutti la sua stessa esperienza, probabilmente questo mondo sarebbe un po', forse non molto, ma un po' migliore. Oggi il problema è, come si sottolinea anche nel lavoro di Dawit Petros, il fatto che dove una volta c'era un passaggio, il Mediterraneo, oggi c'è una barriera fatta di morti. Dove prima c'era accoglienza, oggi c'è respingimento. E quando lei mi chiede perché, io le rispondo perché evidentemente ci sono dei racconti di paura che servono e hanno più forza dei racconti di speranza e accoglienza. Però poi mi fermo perché divento utopico. Grazie per la sua testimonianza.
Oui,
se vuole me la può dire fuori.
Dobbiamo tradurre.
La facciamo dopo.
Traduction est importante en ce moment.
Monsieur demandait pourquoi l'immigration, est-ce que les immigrés ressentent le racisme, justement. La réponse est que il fut un temps où il y avait plus d'acceptation et que si tout le monde avait une tolérance comme monsieur l'a démontré maintenant, il y aura peut-être le monde un petit peu meilleur, alors que la Méditerranée ne serait plus un bloc comme il est maintenant, comme une serrure, une porte à franchir et à déverrouiller, il serait encore un lieu de passage.
qu'Uoldelul? Avete qualcosa da aggiungere a questa conversazione? Est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à ajouter? Something to add?
So just a very short comment. I think one additional factor to take into account is the role of the states. States are the main source of trouble. States need to exercise the power over citizens to control their movement. So the nation state is one of the main issues which contribute to this hostility which periodically emerge against migrants according to the complex developments of economics and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yes, my name is Connie Gutsu-McFarland. I simply have a reflection. We spoke about multi-layered histories and the irony of Italy now being the gateway to immigrants. I'm wondering what is the irony of Italians having elected a prime minister with a neo-fascist past and who is deadly against immigrants from the African countries that Italy itself colonized, about 100 or so years ago.
We
Is
can
on the
answer
comment.
this question.
Such a pity. I can answer.
I was so into the question. I wasn't looking at the timer.
Sorry, it was just a comment. I agree with your comment. It's very ironic, sarcastic, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here with us today. Grazie qu'Uoldelul e grazie Francesco. È molto tardi in Italia adesso, allora sarebbe un momento di chiudere la conferenza e vogliamo invitarvi per un spuntino et un bicchiere di vino con noi si volete restare. Mais merci tout le monde et merci à vous trois et merci à Louise et à la Galerie de l'UQAM et à toutes les personnes qui nous ont aidés.
Non, si vous permettez, on va quand même adresser quelques remerciements officiels, étant donné l'importance des gens que nous avons entendus aujourd'hui. Alors, merci aux participants là-bas, très loin. C'est pas facile de parler devant son écran. Thank you so much for being with us today. Grazie mille. Merci Marisa Portolese. Vraiment, sans toi, ça n'aurait pas été pareil. Merci infiniment. Évidemment, on fait ces projets avec le Conseil des arts du Canada, le Conseil des arts et des lettres du Québec. Vous vous imaginez bien. Je voudrais signaler la présence parmi nous de notre vice-recteur à la recherche-création, M. Christian Agbobli, qui s'est joint à nous pour une partie de l'après-midi. Les collègues, les artistes, les amis et Dawit, you're exceptional. On veut t'adopter. Merci beaucoup. Merci Sandro.
Et merci à la Casa d'Italia, à Giovanna Giordano, à la Galerie de l'UQAM, à toute son équipe et à Luis Derry.
Merci aux équipes. Merci. Alors, bon appétito et on prend un verre ensemble, si vous voulez bien.